Great. Our next speaker, well, obviously social media is having an impact in concrete ways. In the last year, we saw Bank of America back off on a charge fee because of protests organized online. We saw Verizon back down quickly. Lots and lots of companies in the business arena are facing a new kind of network power that's coming from consumers banding together. So we're very happy to have Taren Stinebrickner-Kauffman, who is the CEO and founder of a new organization called SomeOfUs.org, talk about their efforts to turn consumers into much more powerful political players. Taren, there you go.
Hi, everyone. I'm here today to talk about a kind of power that we don't always think of as political, consumer power. First, I'm going to wind back a couple hundred years, so bear with me. For much of human history, rulers told their subjects that their political sovereignty derived from the gods. Sometimes they even told their subjects that they were gods. In Europe, it was called divine right, and the Pope sat above monarchs in the hierarchy. Between 150 and 300 years ago, the Western world underwent a great transformation in the definition of political sovereignty. The biggest inflection point was 1776. The Declaration of Independence read in part that governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Now, the American Revolution was far from perfect. It took hundreds of years for women and people of color to get the right to vote, and even today, many people are effectively disenfranchised. But that phrase, the consent of the governed, rewrote how we define political legitimacy. And the man who penned those words had serious concerns about whether this would last. If you're going to listen to any part of this talk, this is the phrase to listen to. Thomas Jefferson wrote in the early 1800s, "I hope we shall crush in its birth the aristocracy of our moneyed corporations, which dare already to challenge our government to a trial of strength and bid defiance to the laws of our country." By just 100 years later, in the early 1900s, mega corporations like Standard Oil held both the Capitol Hill and the people of the U.S. in its tentacles, as this editorial cartoon depicts. And now, 100 years after that, more than half of the world's largest 100 economies are multinational corporations, not governments or countries. Civics textbooks would have you believe that in modern democratic republics, people elect governments, and governments give limited powers to corporations which they regulate in the public good. I'm here to tell you that's not how it really works. We live in a world where corporations act as sovereign entities, sovereign political entities, as much as governments do. We're in the middle of the next great transformation in political sovereignty. Corporations regulate governments just as much as the other way around, and they do so not with the consent of the governed, but in the interest of the wealthy economic elite. A few examples. Money in politics. This is the one we're all most familiar with, right? Over $1 billion are going to be spent in this year's U.S. election alone, much of it from corporations. Regulatory capture. Monsanto employee Margaret Miller wrote a research report arguing that a new growth hormone for cows was safe, even though it had already been banned in Europe. She then quit her job, took a new job at the FDA, and her first act was to approve the report she had just written while she was at Monsanto. Monopoly on force is something we've long seen as defining government, and yet increasingly, wars are being waged by corporations like Halliburton and Blackwater, and they're even writing our very foreign policy. Globalization has made the problem bigger. Corporations take not just a bird's eye view, but a moon's eye view. They play governments off one another. The fossil fuel industry has been able to prevent progress on a global climate treaty simply by stopping a climate bill in the U.S. Senate. Corporations go jurisdiction hopping. When one country strengthens environmental and labor regulations, They move their factories to another country where the government is weaker. We've even gotten to the point where corporations have rewritten international trade law so that it's illegal for governments to regulate the activities of corporations within their own borders. Philip Morris is suing Australia for trying to tighten its restrictions on tobacco packaging. So just think for a moment how extraordinary that is. The duly elected democratic representatives of the people of Australia decided that it was in the people's interest that cigarettes should be sold in plain packages. But they're legally prevented from enforcing those regulations because it's against the interest of a few wealthy owners of a tobacco company half a world away. So in a world in which corporations act as sovereign political entities, how can we as citizens wield political power? There are 3 steps. First step is to recognize that economic power is political power in this world. We have a responsibility not just to act as responsible, engaged, informed political citizens and voters, but also as engaged, informed economic citizens, consumers, investors, and workers. Second step is to recognize exactly how much how much economic power we have. Retail shareholders collectively control more than a third of the shares in public corporations. Corporations spend billions of dollars marketing to us every year because our opinions matter. And in some ways, consumer power is more democratic than political power has ever been. Coca-Cola literally cares what every person in the world thinks of it, which is more than you can say for any politician in history. The third step is to recognize how much power the internet is giving us to harness our economic citizenship. Global organizations like Avaz.org and 350.org have begun to show what truly global, rapid response online campaigning can look like. But when it comes to mobilizing consumer power, we're just at the very beginning of harnessing that potential. 6 months ago, I launched someofus.org with the goal of doing so. We've run dozens of campaigns against national and multinational corporations, and we've seen massive consumer interest, with over 650,000 people joining our email list in that time. Here's an example of the kind of campaign that we run. The Coalition of Immokalee Workers is a group of Florida farm workers. They've been fighting for decades to improve working conditions on tomato farms in Florida. Workers there get paid well under minimum wage often. They don't get shade and water breaks. Some of the farms have even been prosecuted for slavery, for instance, for locking workers in trucks as punishment. The coalition has managed to get many prominent corporations to sign on to their Fair Foods program, where the corporations promise to buy tomatoes only from farms that the workers have certified. 2 summers ago, they started trying to get Trader Joe's into the agreement. For almost a year and a half, Trader Joe's essentially ignored them, of all companies, right? And, the workers were using all the tricks in their book. About a month after we launched, we joined the campaign because our members are Trader Joe's consumers, and frankly, we don't want to buy tomatoes picked by slaves, right? So we sent 65,000 of our members sent messages directly to the Trader Joe's CEO. The next week, thousands of them either called the company or hand-delivered a letter to the manager at their local Trader Joe's when they went on their weekly grocery run. The next week, Trader Joe's signed the agreement. Now just think for a second about how you would have run that campaign 15 years ago. How would you have gotten 65,000 consumers? I don't know, maybe sign a postcard, right? In some way directly communicate with the CEO. Would have taken a lot of time and effort. A lot. This whole campaign took my staff about 1 week's worth of person time, right? So the internet has dramatically changed the way that consumers can interact with corporations. As corporations face this new networked reality, we're seeing a string of initial victories. For instance, in the first half of this year alone, dozens of corporations have dropped funding for right-wing extremists as they face consumer backlash over their association with groups like ALEC, the Heartland Institute, or Rush Limbaugh. These campaigns are important, these victories are important, but they're just the beginning. Imagine what a networked, global, tech-savvy movement like some of us can do in a few years. British consumers could fund high-tech surveillance equipment for Cambodian workers to take into their sweatshops and monitor conditions in the Adidas supply chain. Millions of us could coordinate globally to push our pension and mutual funds to divest from the fossil fuel industry. We could pool small dollar donations to fund lawsuits that governments have neither the resources nor the political will to pursue. When it comes to money in politics, ALEC and the Heartland Institute are a great start, but the Chamber of Commerce is many times more powerful. And the Chamber fights every day for laws or to change laws in ways that would hurt consumers around the world. They fight for internet censorship. They fight to undermine corporate restrictions on bribery and corruption. So imagine companies like Toyota that are members of the Chamber and that have a global consumer base. Tens of thousands of people could rally outside of Toyota dealerships around the world until Toyota left the Chamber, and then take on the next company and the next company until any company with a global market realized that it couldn't afford to be associated with the Chamber. 250 years ago, a revolution was brewing. It was brewing against the established monarchies in Europe. That revolution succeeded in part because it was able to operate in a new space, a new frontier where those established powers were weak. Today, a new revolution is brewing. It's brewing against the corporate powers that be, and it's brewing at the great new frontier, the internet. I hope you'll meet me there.